A ruthless millionaire forced a waitress to play the violin at an upscale party, intending to humiliate her. However, as soon as she began to play, the entire room fell silent. Outside, the sounds of the bustling city streets were a constant reminder that life kept moving forward without a pause. But in the small, dimly lit room where Abigail sat, time seemed to slow down. She gently placed the violin on her shoulder, the bow hovering above the strings, and exhaled a deep, steady breath. Her fingers glided across the worn wood, effortlessly finding the familiar notes she had played countless times before. Yet each performance still felt like the very first. With her eyes closed, the melody filled the room, soft, melancholic, and brimming with memories of her grandfather, who had gifted her this violin. The instrument was old, its surface scratched and faded, but it was the one possession she cherished above all else. Her grandfather had been a musician in a small-town orchestra. Before he passed, he entrusted her with the violin, telling her, "This instrument is more than just wood and strings, Abigail. It's a bridge to your dreams. Keep playing and one day it will take you there." His words echoed in her heart every time she played. But life hadn't been easy for Abigail. She was born into a modest family. Her mother worked long hours as a seamstress, and her father was a carpenter, struggling to make ends meet. Savannah, a city of contrasts, combined historic beauty with the harsh realities faced by those living in the margins of poverty. Despite her parents' tireless work, they couldn't afford to send her to a prestigious music school or buy her a new violin. All she had was the gift her grandfather had given her, and the hope that someday, someone would recognize her talent. By day, Abigail worked as a waitress in one of the city's high-end restaurants. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped her family make ends meet. The restaurant was frequented by Savannah's wealthiest residents, people who casually discussed exotic vacations, designer clothes, and second homes as if they were the most ordinary things in the world. Abigail overheard their conversations as she poured wine and cleared plates. Her movements were steady and polite, but inside, she felt worlds apart from the patrons she served. Despite her exhausting shifts, Abigail never missed a night of practice. The moment her shift ended and the restaurant's doors closed, she would rush home, where her parents, exhausted from their own long days, were usually already asleep. She would quietly enter the small room they had allowed her to use as a practice space. For the next few hours, she lost herself in her music. Outside, the city quieted, and in those moments it was just her and the violin. Playing was more than a dream for Abigail. It was a necessity. It was her escape from the weight of her responsibilities and the constant worry about whether they would have enough money to make it through the month. In those rare moments she felt free, even if only for a while. But dreams don't pay the bills. Opportunities didn't present themselves at the end of each practice session. There were nights when she wondered if this was all life had in store for her. Countless nights spent alone, playing for no one but herself. She had applied to numerous music academies, but the rejection letters always arrived. "You have potential, but we regret to inform you." The words stung every time. But Abigail refused to let them defeat her. She still had her violin, and as long as she could still play, there was hope. As the last note of her practice lingered in the air, Abigail opened her eyes. The room was quiet and still, with the faint buzz of city life barely audible. She lowered the violin and gently placed it back into its case, her hands lingering on the worn edges for a moment before she stood and stretched her tired muscles. The hours had slipped by again, and it was well past midnight. With a sigh, she walked over to the window and gazed out at the quiet streets below. Somewhere out there, people were living lives she could only dream of. Lives filled with music, applause, and bright lights. She wondered if she'd ever have a life like that. Tomorrow she'd be back at the restaurant, weaving between tables, balancing trays, and offering polite smiles to people who wouldn't even remember her name by the time they left. But tonight, in this small, quiet room, she was more than just a waitress. She was a musician, a dreamer. And for a few precious moments that was enough. The sound of clinking glasses and low murmurs filled the grand ballroom of the Whitman estate. The room glowed in the golden light of chandeliers that hung like crystal stars above the crowd. Every corner of the expansive hall sparkled, from the polished marble floors to the ornate, gold-framed mirrors that reflected the evening's extravagance. Guests dressed in luxurious gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos drifted through the room as though they were floating on air, sipping champagne and exchanging casual pleasantries. It was a world far removed from the one Abigail knew. At the center of it all stood Garrett Whitman, a man whose presence commanded the entire space. Tall and poised, he moved through the elite circles of Savannah with ease. His smile was sharp and calculated, never quite reaching his eyes. Born into wealth, Garrett wore it like a second skin. Everything about him radiated power and privilege, from the custom-made suit that fit him perfectly to the way people leaned in when he spoke, eager to capture even the smallest bit of his attention. He was hosting one of his legendary soirees, lavish events where Savannah's wealthiest flocked for a chance to rub elbows with the man who had the power to make or break fortunes. These events were more than just gatherings. They were games, displays of his wealth designed to remind everyone of their place in the social hierarchy. Tonight was no different. Garrett had carefully orchestrated every detail, from the gourmet dishes to the live orchestra playing softly in the background, crafting the ideal atmosphere for Savannah's elite to bask in their own importance. Abigail, however, was there for a completely different reason. She was simply part of the waitstaff, invisible in her plain black uniform, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres and refilling glasses for people who wouldn't even spare her a glance. She had worked at the Whitman Estates events before, and each time it felt more surreal than the last. The extravagance, the casual display of wealth, it was a world she could never be a part of. As she weaved through the crowd, she kept her head down, balancing a tray of champagne flutes with practiced precision. She overheard snippets of conversation as she passed by. Talk of summer homes in the Hamptons, vacations in Europe, and stock market successes. It was a world so distant from her own, where the most exciting thing that could happen in a week was saving up enough money to buy a new set of strings for her violin. Despite her best efforts to blend into the background, Garrett's eyes eventually found her. He had been engaged in a conversation with a group of businessmen when his gaze casually drifted across the room and landed on the young woman navigating through the crowd. Something about her caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she moved so quietly, so purposefully, as if she were trying to blend into the shadows. Or perhaps it was the faint look of exhaustion etched on her face, a look he'd seen on countless others, people working themselves to the bone for a fraction of what they truly deserved. Whatever it was, Garrett felt a familiar flicker of amusement. He thrived in moments like these where he could remind those beneath him of their place, show them that in his world, they were there solely to serve. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. She glanced up and briefly locked eyes with Garrett before quickly looking away. She knew better than to make eye contact with the guests, especially someone like Garrett Whitman. The other waitstaff had warned her about him. His temper, his arrogance, and his sharp, mocking sense of humor. She made her way toward him, being careful not to spill a drop of champagne as she balanced the tray. When she reached him, Garrett flashed a smile that made her skin prickle. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with something she couldn't quite place. "Abigail," she replied softly, doing her best to keep her voice steady. "Abigail," he repeated, rolling the name around on his tongue, savoring it like it was something strange and interesting. "Tell me, Abigail," he continued, "what do you do when you're not serving drinks?" She hesitated, unsure of his intentions. "I play the violin," she said quietly, almost immediately regretting the words the moment they left her lips. Garrett's smile stretched wider at her response. "The violin? How charming." He turned toward the men around him, who chuckled at his feigned interest. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced loudly, drawing the attention of those nearby, "we have a musician in our midst." Abigail felt her stomach twist in a knot. She could practically feel the weight of their eyes on her, judging and mocking. She wasn't sure what Garrett expected from her, but it certainly didn't feel good. Sensing her discomfort, Garrett leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Why don't you show us, Abigail?" He gestured toward the orchestra set up nearby. "There's a violin right over there. Why not play something for us?" The room seemed to close in around her. Abigail's throat tightened, her palms growing clammy. She didn't want to do this, especially not in front of this crowd. But she knew better than to refuse Garrett. People didn't say no to Garrett Whitman. The silence that followed his challenge was suffocating. Abigail could feel every set of eyes in the room on her, waiting for her next move. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her hands turned cold as she gripped the tray of champagne glasses. She had expected a quiet night, disappearing into the background as she always did. But now, here she was, standing at the center of attention, not because she chose to, but because Garrett Whitman had willed it. She glanced over at the orchestra, where a violin rested on a stand, just waiting for her. It wasn't her violin, the one her grandfather had given her, the one she knew intimately. But that didn't matter. She didn't want to play. Not here. Not in front of people who would undoubtedly judge her and expect her to fail. The heat of humiliation began to creep up her neck, burning her cheeks. Garrett was watching her closely, that same amused smile still playing on his lips. This wasn't a request, it was a command, and there was no escaping it. "Go on, Abigail," he said, his voice light but holding a darker edge. "Show us what you've got." The laughter that echoed from the group around him made her skin crawl. She could hear the condescension in their voices, the quiet mockery they didn't even bother to hide. To them, this was just another form of entertainment. Humiliating the staff was part of the evening's fun. Taking a shaky breath, Abigail placed the tray down on a nearby table, wiping her damp palms on her apron. She walked toward the orchestra, each step feeling like lead. The room seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the walk toward the violin stand feeling like the longest journey of her life. When she finally reached it, she hesitated before picking up the violin, her fingers brushing lightly against the strings as she adjusted her hold. It felt foreign, unfamiliar in her hands, unlike the one her grandfather had gifted her, the one she'd spent years mastering. Her pulse raced as she stood in front of the crowd, the weight of their stares pressing down on her. She could see their expectations written across their faces. This poor girl, what could she possibly offer them? Garrett stood to the side, arms crossed, clearly relishing the moment. Abigail closed her eyes for a brief second, trying to collect herself. Her mind raced, and for a fleeting moment, all she wanted to do was drop the violin and run. But she couldn't do that. If she fled now, she'd be giving Garrett exactly what he wanted. Her complete humiliation. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. "This violin is your bridge, Abigail. It will take you where you need to go." Taking a deep breath, Abigail steadied her trembling hands and raised the bow to the strings. The room fell silent, the anticipation hanging thick in the air. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she couldn't focus on that now. She had to focus on the music. She had to let it carry her. The first note was soft, hesitant as it floated through the air. It wasn't perfect, not at first. Her grip was too tight, her fingers stiff with nerves. But as the melody took shape, something inside her shifted. Her muscles relaxed, and her bow moved more fluidly. She played the song her grandfather had taught her, the one that always calmed her in the darkest moments. It was filled with a melancholy peace, but also with hope. The music carried the weight of her dreams, her struggles. The laughter that had filled the room earlier faded away. The mocking whisper stilled as the notes flowed from the violin. They seemed to take on a life of their own, filling the room with a quiet, aching beauty. Abigail's eyes remained closed as she let the music guide her. Abigail lost herself in the melody. For a brief moment it was just her and the violin, and nothing else mattered. The room seemed to shrink around her, the crowd fading into the background as the music wrapped around them all. The tension that had filled the air slowly faded, replaced by something softer, more profound. The notes hung in the air like a gentle breeze, touching everyone present. Even those who had initially laughed at her, Garrett, who had been wearing that smug grin only moments before, felt the shift. His expression began to change, the smugness draining from his face, replaced by something else, something that even he hadn't expected. The melody Abigail played stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. It was a strange, almost unsettling sensation, like a long-forgotten memory trying to resurface. The room remained completely silent as Abigail poured her heart and soul into every note. This was more than just a performance for her. It was a release, a way to express all the things she couldn't put into words. She didn't care about the audience anymore. This was for her. This was her moment, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. As the final note lingered in the air and faded into the quiet, Abigail lowered the violin. Her breathing was heavy, her heart still pounding, but the room remained eerily quiet. She opened her eyes, half expecting to see the same judgment and disdain from the crowd. But there was only silence. No laughter, no whispers. Just silence. And then slowly the sound of applause began to fill the room. At first the applause was soft, as though the guests weren't sure how to respond. But soon it swelled into a full, resounding ovation. Abigail stood frozen, still holding the violin, her mind struggling to process what was happening. She had braced herself for mocking laughter, for cruel remarks. But this was something she never expected. The sound of clapping echoed through the grand room, and for a moment, Abigail felt like she was floating. Her heart, which had been racing with fear just moments ago, now beat wildly with disbelief. She glanced around, catching sight of people she had been serving only minutes before, now on their feet, applauding with genuine admiration. Some had even wiped away tears, moved by the melancholic beauty of her playing. Abigail couldn't remember the last time she had been given such praise. If she had ever received it, it had always been overshadowed by long days of hard work, rejection letters, and the constant doubt that her dream might be too far out of reach. But here, in this opulent ballroom surrounded by Savannah's wealthiest and most influential, they weren't seeing her as just another waitress. For the first time they were seeing her as an artist. Her fingers still gripped the violin as though afraid to let go. Afraid the moment might vanish if she moved too quickly. But then a voice cut through the applause, a familiar voice that sent a chill down her spine. "Bravo," Garrett Whitman said, clapping slowly, deliberately. His smile had disappeared, replaced by something unreadable in his sharp, piercing gaze. He stepped closer to Abigail as the crowd gradually quieted. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. The applause still echoed in the background, but it now felt distant, muffled, as Garrett's presence seemed to grow larger. His eyes locked with hers, but the amusement she had seen earlier was gone. In its place was something far more serious, something unsettling. Something she didn't expect. "You're quite the hidden talent," he said, his voice lower now, just for her to hear. His tone, once laced with mockery, now had an odd edge of curiosity. Abigail swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to bask in the praise, to feel the validation she had longed for. But the way Garrett was looking at her, so intensely, so differently from just moments ago, made her uneasy. This was the same man who had tried to humiliate her, and now, he was complimenting her as if her performance had awakened something within him. Garrett turned back to the room, addressing the guests with the polished ease of someone used to being in control. "It seems we've been treated to an impromptu performance by an unexpected virtuoso," he said, his voice carrying smoothly across the room. "Let's give her another round of applause," he added, and the crowd responded, clapping again, though this time with a mix of admiration and lingering surprise. Abigail felt her cheeks flush as the applause washed over her. But her focus was on Garrett. Something about the way he handled the situation didn't sit right with her. Was he still toying with her? Or had her music genuinely caught him off guard? Then through the crowd a figure emerged. An older man with silver hair, his presence commanding attention without effort. He moved toward Abigail with purpose, his eyes never leaving her. The applause had just begun to fade when he reached her, offering a soft smile. His expression held something more, a quiet approval, like he had been waiting for this moment. "You play beautifully," the man said, his voice kind and warm, but with the authority of someone used to being listened to. "I'm Leonard Chastain, conductor of the New York Philharmonic." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She had heard of Leonard Chastain, of course she had. He was a legend in the world of classical music, the kind of person who could make or break a career with just a few words. She stared at him wide-eyed, unable to fully process the fact that he was standing in front of her, speaking to her. I'm Abigail," she stammered, suddenly feeling small again in the presence of such greatness. "I know," Chastain replied with a smile. "I've heard many talented musicians in my time, but rarely do I encounter someone who plays with such emotion and depth. You have a gift, Abigail. One that shouldn't be confined to this room or hidden away in a restaurant." His words hit her like a wave crashing over her. Was this really happening? Was someone like Leonard Chastain, someone of his stature, really offering her the kind of validation she had always dreamed of? "I'd like to invite you to audition for a spot with my orchestra," Chastain continued, his tone now serious. I think you could be something truly special. Abigail's mind was spinning. This felt like a moment straight out of her dreams. Yet, standing in this grand ballroom, surrounded by people who had once looked down on her, she could hardly believe it was real. The weight of the offer, and what it could mean for her future, pressed heavily on her chest. Behind Abigail, Garrett stood silently, observing the exchange with an unreadable expression. His attempt to publicly humiliate her had completely backfired, and now, instead of embarrassment, she was being offered a life-changing opportunity by one of the most revered figures in classical music. For the first time that evening, Abigail felt something inside her stir. A spark of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, hope. It wasn't just a flicker. It was a real, tangible hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something beyond her wildest dreams. The words Leonard Chastain had spoken hung in the air long after the last clap faded. Abigail stood frozen, her thoughts racing to catch up with the moment. Audition for the New York Philharmonic. Was this happening? Was she imagining it? Felt too unbelievable to be real. She was just a waitress who played the violin in her spare time. The room, once filled with lively chatter, now seemed to hold its breath. Guests exchanged surprised looks, and the whispers began, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. They had all witnessed what should have been a humiliating failure transform into an unexpected triumph. And now, the girl who had once faded into the background had become the center of attention. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at Leonard, still trying to process what had just unfolded. This was everything she had ever dreamed of, everything she had never dared to believe possible. But doubts crept in. Why would someone like him offer her such an opportunity? She had no credentials, no formal education, no prestigious connections. She was just a girl from Savannah with a beat-up violin and a stubborn dream. I don't even know what to say, she stammered, her voice shaky. You don't need to say anything right now, Leonard said with a gentle, reassuring smile. Take your time. But I mean it, Abigail. You've got something rare. Something that can't be taught. Your potential goes beyond just skill. When you're ready, we'll set up an audition. Her mouth was dry, and her hands, still clutching the violin, trembled slightly. How could she say no to this? The chance to audition for one of the most famous orchestras in the world? But a tiny voice of doubt still nagged at her. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she wasn't ready? What if all of this was a mistake? She forced herself to take a steadying breath and nodded, barely able to speak. Thank you, she whispered, the words barely audible. Thank you so much. Leonard nodded in return, his gaze warm and full of encouragement. We'll be in touch, Abigail. And remember, don't let anyone make you feel unworthy. You've earned this. With that, he turned and made his way back through the crowd, disappearing into the throng of well-dressed guests. Abigail stood still, the weight of what had just happened sinking in slowly. Her mind was a whirl of excitement, disbelief, and shock. She was still holding the violin, her fingers lightly brushing against the strings as if she might wake from a dream any moment. The room had shifted around her, and for a moment, everything felt surreal. The violin wasn't hers. It wasn't the one her grandfather had given her. But in that moment, it had opened a door to something she never thought possible. She straightened up, her gaze sweeping over the room. And there, standing just a few feet away, was Garrett Whitman. His arms were crossed, his face impassive, but his eyes were locked onto her. The smugness from earlier was gone, replaced by something entirely different. For a long moment they stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken tension. Abigail didn't know what to expect now, an apology? More mockery? But instead, Garrett's lips curved into a small, tight smile. Well, he said, his voice low and measured, I'll admit it, I underestimated you. Abigail blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected him to say that, not after the way he had treated her. Anger stirred inside her, a desire to lash out at him for trying to humiliate her earlier. But part of her, still shaken from the unexpected offer, felt a strange sense of satisfaction. You didn't think I was any good, she said, her voice now more confident, as if she were regaining her footing. Garrett's smile faltered slightly, but he didn't look away. I suppose not, he admitted, a hint of regret edging his voice. But you proved me wrong. There was something in his eyes now, something different. It wasn't admiration, but it was respect. Maybe. Abigail wasn't sure, and frankly, she wasn't interested in trying to figure out what was going on in Garrett Whitman's mind. She had her own emotions to navigate. Before she could speak again, another guest approached Garrett, distracting him. He gave her one last look, then turned and disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Abigail standing there, her mind still spinning. As the orchestra resumed playing, filling the space where the silence had hung so heavily moments before, Abigail took a deep breath. She was still trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. She had come here tonight expecting nothing more than to do her job, to blend into the background like she always did. But now she was leaving with an offer that could change her life. Felt overwhelming. As she made her way toward the exit, weaving through the crowd with a newfound ease, her thoughts raced. Could she really do this? Was she ready? Doubts lingered, but beneath them, a small flicker of hope refused to be dimmed. For the first time in ages, her dream of becoming a violinist didn't feel like a far-off fantasy. It felt real. Felt possible. Garrett Whitman, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that had settled over him since Abigail's performance. He had never been one to dwell on emotions, especially his own. They were messy, complicated, things he couldn't afford to entertain. His empire had been built on cold, calculated decisions, never letting anything cloud his judgment. But tonight something had changed. That melody, it had stirred something deep within him, something long buried. As the evening went on, and guests continued to compliment him on his successful event, Garrett found himself retreating to the edge of the room. His mind drifted away from the pleasantries around him, his thoughts drawn back to Abigail. Garrett stood staring out the large windows of the ballroom, but his mind was far from the glittering city lights of Savannah. His thoughts were consumed by the haunting melody that still echoed in his mind. The way Abigail had moved her fingers across the violin with such effortless grace, such raw passion. He hadn't felt anything like that in years. Music used to be a part of him, a part of his life he had buried deep. But tonight, Abigail had brought it all rushing back, and he couldn't ignore the pull. The melody, it was almost familiar, so much so that it unsettled him. At first he couldn't understand why it felt so significant, why it had stirred something inside of him. But as the evening wore on, memories he thought he'd locked away began to claw their way to the surface, impossible to ignore. Garrett turned away from the crowd, his eyes scanning the horizon, his mind drifting back to his childhood home, to the dimly lit living room where his mother had once played the piano late into the night. It had been so long since he thought about those evenings, but tonight, it felt like he was right back there. His mother, the one person who had truly understood him, had been the soul of the house, gentle, kind, and immensely talented. Music had been her way of expressing what words couldn't. Garrett spent countless nights sitting at her feet, listening to her fingers glide across the keys, filling the room with music that felt like magic. But all of that had been taken from him. By the accident, by the night his mother was ripped from his life. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Her death had been sudden, an accident that stole her away when he was just a teenager. And in the aftermath, Garrett closed off, burying his grief beneath layers of cold ambition. He threw himself into his father's business, learning how to be ruthless, how to succeed at any cost, and how to shut out the world. But now, Abigail's performance had shattered that wall. The floodgates opened. Her melody, it was the same one his mother had played. He hadn't realized it at first, but now the pieces clicked together. The melancholy notes Abigail had played were the exact same ones his mother had composed, a piece she had never shared with anyone, not even him. How did Abigail know that song? How could she possibly have played it? The thought gnawed at him, unsettling him in ways he couldn't explain. There was something there, a connection he couldn't quite define, but he felt it, something between the music and her. Garrett clenched his fists, his jaw tight as he stared out into the darkened city. He hated this feeling. Vulnerable. Exposed. The emotions he had spent years suppressing were rising to the surface, and he didn't know how to handle them. He had always been in control of his life, of his success, but now that control felt like it was slipping away. He thought of Abigail, of her face as she played, eyes closed, her expression serene but intense. The way she had poured her heart into that violin, playing with a kind of passion he had long forgotten. It wasn't just talent she had. It was something deeper, something pure. Abigail was everything Garrett had distanced himself from in his single-minded pursuit of success. She had reminded him of the one person he had loved more than anything in the world. And in that moment, despite all of his efforts to undermine her, she had proven him wrong. A bitterness stirred in him, but it was tempered by something else. Something softer. Respect. It was a feeling he wasn't used to. Something that unsettled him even more. Garrett had always been the one in control, the one calling the shots. But Abigail had turned everything upside down. She had shaken him in ways he didn't understand. Turning away from the window, Garrett's mind whirled. He wasn't sure what he wanted, but he knew he couldn't shake the pull to learn more about her. How had she come to play that song? Why was it so significant? He didn't know the answers, but he couldn't just let this go. For the first time in years, something inside him urged him to dig deeper, to understand. He didn't know how this would play out, but he knew one thing for sure. This wouldn't be the last time he saw Abigail. She had awoken something in him, something he had buried, and he couldn't walk away from it, not yet. The next few days were a whirlwind for Abigail. Her life, which had once been quiet and predictable, had been turned upside down. She had always faded into the background, blending into the rhythm of waitressing and practicing the violin in solitude. But now everything had changed. The attention, the recognition, it was overwhelming, and it felt like the weight of her dream was suddenly bearing down on her all at once. The invitation to audition for the New York Philharmonic was more than just an opportunity. It was the lifeline she had been waiting for, the chance to make her dreams real. But the enormity of it terrified her. The orchestra was legendary, and Leonard Chastain was a figure unlike any other in classical music. One word from him could open doors she hadn't even dared to dream of, but the pressure was immense. Could she really live up to the expectations? Was she ready? Each night after her shift, Abigail would retreat to her tiny room, picking up her violin, and playing until her fingers ached. But now it wasn't just practice anymore. It was for something bigger. It was for something real. The stakes had never felt higher. With each note, the fear crept in. What if she wasn't good enough? What if this was all too much for her? There was no turning back now. The audition date had already been set, and it was fast approaching. Time moved faster with each passing day. And before she knew it, Abigail found herself standing outside the rehearsal hall of a local orchestra, clutching her violin case like it was the only thing grounding her. The hall was modest but had an air of grandeur about it, with high ceilings and polished floors that echoed her every step. She took a deep breath as she walked in, her heart racing, a mixture of nerves and determination taking over. The rehearsal was a challenge. Leonard had arranged for Abigail to practice with a group of musicians in preparation for her audition, and today was her first official session. It was a chance to refine her performance, to prove to herself that she belonged here. But as she entered the room and saw the other musicians setting up, her nerves flared again. These people were professionals, men and women who had been part of orchestras for years. They barely looked up when she walked in, focused on tuning their instruments and chatting amongst themselves. Abigail felt a wave of insecurity wash over her. Who was she to be here? Surrounded by accomplished musicians. A waitress with no formal training, no prestigious pedigree. She didn't even own a proper violin. She made her way to a spot at the far end of the room, unzipping her violin case with trembling hands. The instrument, though well-worn and loved, looked out of place next to the polished, expensive instruments around her. Her grandfather's gift had carried her this far, but standing among these seasoned musicians, it suddenly felt inadequate. Still, it was all she had as the rehearsal began. The conductor, a stern man with graying hair, called for silence. Abigail focused on the sheet music in front of her, trying to push past the nervous tremors in her fingers. But as the first notes filled the room, it was clear she was out of her depth. The musicians played with precision, their timing flawless, their sound full and rich. Abigail, on the other hand, struggled to keep up. Her bow slipped on the strings. Her fingers faltered. Each mistake seemed to echo louder in the spacious rehearsal hall. Halfway through the session, the conductor stopped and looked directly at her. "Miss Abigail," he said, his tone firm yet neutral, "you need to stay with the tempo. This isn't a solo performance. You must blend in with the orchestra." The sting of his words hit her hard. But Abigail nodded, swallowing the lump of insecurity that rose in her throat. She tried again, determined to stay in sync with the group, but the pressure only made her mistakes worse. By the time the session ended, her confidence had all but evaporated. She quietly packed away her violin, avoiding the curious glances of the other musicians as they filed out of the hall. The evening air felt sharp against her skin as she stepped outside, clutching her violin case tightly. Doubts flooded her mind louder than ever. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't like them. These trained musicians who had spent years honing their craft. She had spent her life waiting tables and practicing alone in a cramped room. What had made her think she could compete with them? But as she stood there trying to gather her thoughts, a voice cut through her spiraling doubts. Rough session. Abigail looked up to see a woman in her 30s, carrying a cello case, smiling at her with a kind, knowing expression. She was one of the musicians from the rehearsal, someone Abigail hadn't spoken to yet. "Yeah," Abigail admitted, her voice shaky. "I guess you could say that." The woman nodded, moving to stand beside her. "Don't let it get to you. We all have bad days. Besides, you've got something most of us don't." Abigail raised an eyebrow, confused. "What's that?" "Heart," the woman said simply. "I heard it in your playing. Sure, you made mistakes, but the way you play, it's clear that it means something to you. That's not something you can teach." Abigail blinked, the woman's words sinking in slowly. Heart. She had always played from her heart, driven by a love for the music and the memories it held. Maybe that was what had carried her this far. "Thanks," she said softly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I needed to hear that." The woman nodded and gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before heading off into the night, leaving Abigail standing there on the steps. The cold air no longer felt as harsh. Though her doubts still lingered, they didn't seem quite as overwhelming now. Maybe, just maybe, she was ready after all. Garrett sat in his office, a cavernous room lined with bookshelves and dark mahogany furniture, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city of Savannah. He had spent the last few days buried in work, diving into meetings, contracts, and business deals. It was his usual way of dealing with anything that threatened to bring up emotions he wasn't ready to confront. But no matter how many emails he answered or how many calls he took, his thoughts kept drifting back to Abigail. It wasn't just her performance that haunted him. That could have been dismissed as a fluke, a moment of unexpected talent that had surprised him. But it was more than that. It was the way her music had pulled something from deep within him, something he thought he had buried long ago. For years, Garrett had closed off that part of himself. He'd told himself that emotions were a weakness, that caring too much only led to pain. And for the most part, it had worked. He had built a life where nothing could touch him unless he allowed it. But Abigail's music had reached past all the walls he had carefully constructed around his heart. The melody she had played, the same one his mother had composed, had brought memories flooding back. Memories of a time when he wasn't this closed-off, calculating man. When he had been human. Garrett sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, trying to shake off the conflict swirling inside him. He wasn't used to feeling this way. Normally, he made decisions quickly, decisively. But this was different. Abigail had stirred something in him that he didn't know how to handle. He had learned more about her over the past few days, quietly inquiring through his network. It wasn't hard to find out who she was. Abigail, the daughter of a seamstress and a carpenter. No formal music education. A waitress by day, a violinist by night. It was clear that she hadn't come from money or privilege. But she had something special. Raw talent and passion that couldn't be bought or taught. And then there was the mystery of the melody. How had she come to play the very same piece his mother had written? The questions kept piling up, but the answer eluded him. And for the first time in a long time, Garrett found himself wanting to know more about Abigail. To understand how she had come to play the music that had once been the soundtrack of his life. Couldn't just be a coincidence. But no matter how much Garrett tried to rationalize it, the answer continued to elude him. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the office door. His assistant, Rachel, peeked in. "Mr. Whitman, you have a call from Mr. Leonard Chastain." Garrett straightened in his chair. Leonard Chastain, the man who had offered Abigail the chance of a lifetime at his event. Garrett hadn't spoken to him directly since that night, but now it seemed the renowned conductor had something to discuss. "Put him through," Garrett said, leaning forward in his chair. A moment later, Leonard's familiar voice filled the room. "Garrett, it's Leonard." "Leonard," Garrett replied smoothly, his tone polite yet professional. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to talk to you about Abigail," Leonard said, getting straight to the point. "I understand you've taken a particular interest in her." Garrett's brow furrowed slightly. "I wouldn't call it a particular interest. I'm just curious. She's clearly talented, as you saw that night." Leonard chuckled softly. "Yes, she is. And I have to say, I've rarely seen someone with so much potential who hasn't had formal training. That's part of why I've invited her to audition for the Philharmonic," Leonard continued. "But she's going to need support if she's going to make it." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Support? She's talented but raw," Leonard explained. "She's never had the resources or guidance she needs to truly hone her skills. You and I both know how competitive the world of classical music is. Talent alone isn't always enough. She's going to need more than just a violin and a dream if she's going to succeed." Garrett leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping on the desk. "What exactly are you asking, Leonard?" "I'm asking if you're willing to help her," Leonard said, his voice firm but not demanding. "You have the means, the connections. She needs someone who believes in her, someone who can give her the opportunity to grow into the artist she's meant to be." Garrett was silent for a long moment. He hadn't expected this. Over the past few days he had been wrestling with his emotions regarding Abigail, unsure of what to do next. Now here was Leonard asking him to take an active role in her future. It was a strange proposition. Garrett wasn't in the habit of helping people. He was known for his business acumen, his ability to turn a profit, not for being a benefactor. But as he sat there, processing Leonard's words, something clicked inside him. Abigail had stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in years. Maybe this was the moment to stop running from that. "All right, I'll think about it," Garrett said, his voice measured. "But I'll need some time." Leonard seemed satisfied with that response. "That's all I ask, Garrett. She deserves a chance. And I think you're the one who can give it to her." After exchanging a few pleasantries, the call ended. Garrett sat there for a while, the weight of the conversation settling in. Could he really do this? Could he step into the role of a mentor, use his resources to help someone rather than control them? The idea of supporting someone else felt strange, yet in some way it also felt oddly right. Abigail had already changed something in him. Maybe this was the next step. He had to stop being a passive observer in her journey. For once, he had to make a decision that wasn't about him. Garrett didn't waste any time after the call with Leonard. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that he couldn't stay on the sidelines. He had never been one to let life just happen to him. He took control, shaped events to fit his needs. But this time it wasn't about him. It was about Abigail and the potential she had, if only she was given the right support. The first step, however, would be the hardest. He had to face her. Garrett knew he had humiliated her at his event, and if he was going to offer help, he needed to address that first. He wasn't used to admitting when he was wrong. But Abigail, she had risen above his taunts, and her music had cut through all his pretenses. She deserved more than just an apology. She deserved to hear the truth. He found her address easily enough. It wasn't far from downtown Savannah, in a modest neighborhood that seemed like a world away from the opulence Garrett was used to. Her apartment was small, humble, really, but it spoke of hard work, persistence, and grit. As he parked his car and walked toward the door, a wave of discomfort washed over him. This was a side of life he had spent years distancing himself from, but here he was stepping into it. He knocked on the door, unsure of what to expect when it opened. It didn't take long for Abigail to answer. The moment she saw him, her expression shifted from surprise to something unreadable. She stood in the doorway, her violin case at her side, clearly about to leave. "Garrett?" she asked, her tone neutral, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of confusion. "What are you doing here?" Garrett cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked. His tailored suit seemed to clash with the modest backdrop of her apartment. He wasn't used to feeling nervous, but here he was, standing awkwardly in front of a woman who had every reason to shut the door in his face. "I came to talk," he said, his voice steady, "about what happened at the event, and about what comes next." Abigail's brow furrowed. She didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, she studied him as if trying to decide if this was some kind of trick. Finally, she stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. "All right, let's talk," she said. Garrett stepped inside, taking in the small, cozy living room. It was simple, but there were personal touches. Sheet music scattered on a worn coffee table. A framed photo of her family on the mantel. It was clear that music was her world, even in this small space. Abigail sat down on the edge of the couch, her posture tense, while Garrett remained standing, unsure of how to start. This wasn't something he was used to. Apologies. Humility. But he had to try. "I owe you an apology," Garrett began, his tone sincere but still measured. "What I did at the event wasn't right. I put you on the spot to humiliate you, and that's not something I'm proud of." Abigail's eyes met his, a flash of surprise crossing her face. She hadn't expected this. Garrett Whitman, the arrogant businessman who had mocked her in front of everyone, was now standing in her modest living room, apologizing. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about that night," he continued, "and I realize now that I was wrong about you. You're not just a waitress or someone to be dismissed. You're a real talent, Abigail. Your music, it's something special," Garrett said, his words heavy with meaning. Abigail crossed her arms, her expression softening just slightly, though the wariness still lingered. "So why are you here?" she asked, her voice guarded. "To make amends," Garrett paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Partially. But also because I believe you have the potential to do something great, and I want to help you get there." Abigail blinked, taken aback. She had expected a lot of things from Garrett: condescension, maybe another round of smug superiority. But this? She hadn't expected this. "Help me? Why?" "Because you've got something money can't buy," Garrett said, his voice firm now, unwavering. "Passion. Raw talent. I've spent my life building empires, but I've never seen anyone play the way you did that night. You reminded me of something I lost a long time ago, and I don't want to see you throw that away just because you didn't have the support you needed." Abigail stared at him, still with her arms crossed, but now the wall she had carefully built around herself seemed to be cracking. There was sincerity in Garrett's voice that she hadn't heard before. For the first time, he didn't feel like the cold, calculating businessman she had come to know. He felt human. "You think I can make it?" she asked, her voice softer now, the vulnerability creeping in. "I know you can," Garrett replied without hesitation. "And I want to help you do it. Leonard Chastain sees it too. He's offering you the opportunity of a lifetime. But you're going to need more than just talent to succeed. You'll need resources, connections, and guidance." Abigail took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling in 1,000 directions. Part of her wanted to shut it all down, to slam the door on this entire chapter of her life and walk away. But another part, the part that had dreamed of becoming a violinist since she was a little girl, couldn't ignore the opportunity standing in front of her. "All right," she said, finally meeting Garrett's gaze with a newfound determination. "I'll accept your help. But this doesn't mean I trust you." Garrett nodded, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Fair enough. I'll earn it." The two of them stood at the precipice of something new. An uneasy partnership, one forged from a shared sense of purpose. Garrett had made his decision, and now it was up to both of them to follow through. Abigail stood backstage, her violin case gripped tightly in her hands. The lights of the concert hall flickered above her, casting a soft glow on her tense face. The faint hum of the audience settling into their seats echoed through the thick curtains, and the anticipation in the air was palpable. This was it, the moment she had been working toward for weeks. Her first solo performance with the orchestra, a chance to prove herself. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the shoulder rest on her violin, the nerves threatening to overwhelm her. But underneath that anxiety was something else, something stronger. Excitement. Determination. She had come a long way from that first night at Garrett's event, where she had been humiliated, only to rise above it with her unexpected performance. Now, with Leonard's guidance and Garrett's unexpected support, she was standing on the brink of something life-changing. Leonard had been instrumental in preparing her for this night. His rehearsals had been grueling, but they had shaped her into a more confident, polished musician. Day after day, Abigail poured every ounce of energy she had into perfecting her technique, mastering the concerto she would perform tonight. It was challenging, beautiful, a true test of her abilities. Still, despite all the preparation, doubts lingered in the back of her mind. The stakes were high, and she knew this performance could make or break her future. The musicians in the Philharmonic were professionals with years of experience, and despite her progress, Abigail still felt like the outsider. But Leonard had reminded her time and again, it wasn't about perfection, it was about heart. And heart was something no one could teach. It was something Abigail had in abundance. As she stood there waiting for her cue, the door to the backstage area opened, and in walked Garrett. Dressed impeccably as always, his expression was softer than she had ever seen it. There was no trace of the arrogance or coldness that had defined their earlier interactions. Instead, he looked at her with a genuine pride she hadn't expected. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low, a note of concern underlying the words. Abigail swallowed hard, feeling her nerves rise again. "I think so," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've practiced," she trailed off, unsure of how to express the swirl of emotions inside her. Garrett stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that almost made her lose her breath. "You're going to be amazing. You've worked so hard for this and you deserve to be here." Abigail looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She had accepted his help, but part of her had still been wary, unsure of his true intentions. But in the weeks since then, Garrett had shown her a side of himself she hadn't expected, a side genuinely invested in her success, not for his own gain, but because he believed in her. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steadier now. "I'm nervous, but I'm ready." Garrett nodded, offering her a rare, small smile. "Good. I'll be out there watching." With that, he stepped back, giving her the space she needed as the stage manager made the final call. It was time. Abigail took a deep breath, steadying herself as she gripped her violin case. The familiar weight of the instrument in her hands was comforting, reminding her of all the hours she had spent practicing, all the dreams she had held on to. This was her moment. She had to own it. The sound of applause swelled as the conductor took his place at the podium. Abigail stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. The concert hall was enormous, far bigger than any venue she had ever performed in before. The lights were blinding, making it hard to see the faces in the audience, but she knew they were out there. Hundreds of eyes watching, waiting. She took her place in the center of the stage, the orchestra behind her. Her gaze scanned the sea of faces, and there among the crowd she spotted Garrett, sitting alongside Leonard and other important figures from the world of music. The pressure was immense, but she refused to let it consume her. The conductor raised his baton, and the first notes of the orchestra filled the hall, soft, deliberate, setting the stage for Abigail's entrance. Abigail's fingers trembled as she lifted her bow to the strings. But as soon as the first note left her violin, everything shifted inside her. The music poured from her like water, flowing effortlessly, each note carrying the passion and emotion she had long held inside. The melody wrapped around the audience, pulling them into the world she had created with every stroke of the bow. The hours of practice, the sleepless nights, the doubts and fears, all of it disappeared as the music took over. In this moment there was nothing but the sound, and it was everything. Her fingers moved effortlessly, gliding across the strings, while the bow danced with precision and grace. The audience sat in rapt attention, the room falling into an awed silence. Abigail lost herself in the music, letting it guide her through the piece, each note rising and falling perfectly, as if the melody itself knew where to lead. When the final note echoed through the hall, fading into a profound silence, Abigail lowered her violin, her heart still racing. The room remained still for a moment, as if everyone were holding their breath. And then the applause began, soft at first, hesitant, but quickly building into a powerful, resounding ovation. The sound washed over her, warm and full of admiration. Abigail stood there, her chest heaving as she breathed in the moment. She had done it. She had performed for an audience that demanded perfection, and instead, she had given them something even better. Something real, something filled with heart. As she scanned the crowd, her eyes found Garrett standing at the back of the room, clapping with a quiet pride she had only seen from him in the last few weeks. Their gazes met, and in that brief instant, Abigail knew that everything had changed, not just for her but for both of them. This was only the beginning. The applause still echoed in her ears as she stepped off the stage, her heart racing with the thrill of what had just happened. She had done it. She had performed in front of a packed concert hall and received a standing ovation. It felt surreal, like she was floating in a dream backstage. The energy was electric. The musicians crowded around her, offering congratulations and praise. Leonard Chastain himself was waiting, his face glowing with approval. "That was extraordinary, Abigail," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "You played with heart, just like I knew you would." "Thank you, Leonard," Abigail replied, breathless but beaming. "I can't believe this is real." "It is," Leonard said, smiling. "And this is just the beginning. You've got a bright future ahead of you, Abigail." "I have no doubt about that." Abigail nodded, the weight of his words settling in. This wasn't just a one-time performance. It was the start of something much bigger. But even as the excitement buzzed around her, there was one person she hadn't spoken to yet. Garrett. As the crowd began to filter out of the concert hall, Abigail spotted him near the exit, watching her with that same unreadable expression. He had been there, just as he'd promised, and now she needed to talk to him. There was something about the way he had acted in the past few weeks, something that hinted at a deeper connection, a shared past she didn't fully understand. She made her way through the remaining musicians and toward him, her heart fluttering with anticipation. Garrett straightened as she approached, slipping his hand into the pocket of his perfectly tailored suit. But there was a softness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "You were brilliant," he said quietly, his voice sincere. "I knew you would be." Abigail felt a warmth flush through her at his praise, but she wasn't here just for compliments. There was something she needed to ask. "Garrett, I have to ask you something," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "That melody, the one I played at your event. It's been in my family for as long as I can remember," she continued, almost breathlessly. "My grandfather taught it to me, but no one ever knew where it came from. How did you recognize it?" Garrett's expression shifted, the calm mask he usually wore flickering, revealing something deeper, something buried. He looked down for a moment as if gathering his thoughts, before meeting her gaze again. "It wasn't just the melody that caught my attention that night," Garrett began, his voice lower, more serious. "It was the way you played it." He paused, his eyes distant, lost in memories. "You see that melody? It was written by my mother." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. His mother. How could that be? "But how?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Garrett hesitated, his gaze drifting to the past. "My mother was a musician, a brilliant one. She wrote that piece years ago, but she never shared it with anyone outside of our home. She used to play it for me when I was a child before she died. I hadn't heard it in years, until you played it that night." A chill ran down Abigail's spine. The melody that had been passed down through her family, the one her grandfather had taught her, had come from Garrett's mother. "How is that possible, Garrett? I don't understand," she whispered. He took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers with quiet intensity. "There's more, Abigail." He paused, as if unsure of how to continue. "I did some digging after that night, trying to understand how you could know a piece of music that only existed in my family. What I found changes everything." Abigail's heart pounded, her pulse quickening. What could he have discovered? "Your grandfather," Garrett said slowly, each word weighted with significance, "wasn't just a musician. He was my mother's first love." Abigail stood frozen, trying to process the enormity of what Garrett had just said. "My grandfather knew your mother?" she asked, her voice shaking. Garrett nodded. "Yes. They were together before she met my father. But it was more than that, Abigail." He took a step closer, his voice low, as if the words he was about to speak carried the weight of a long-held secret. "Your mother, the one you've always known, isn't your biological mother. You're my mother's daughter." The world seemed to tilt as Abigail took a step back, her mind reeling. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. That can't be. I know it's a lot to take in, Garrett said softly, his voice steady. But it's the truth. Your grandfather raised you as his own after my mother died, keeping her identity and your true parentage a secret. He didn't want you caught up in my father's world, the world of power and wealth that destroyed her. Abigail's head spun with the revelation. Everything she had known about her life, the identity she had built, was now a lie. Garrett's mother was her biological mother, and the melody that connected them wasn't just a song. It was a thread that linked them to a shared past. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, the weight of the truth crashing over her. Garrett stepped closer, his expression softening as he placed a hand on her shoulder. You're not alone, Abigail. You've never been alone. We're family. Abigail looked up at him, her vision blurred by the tears, but there was a sense of peace settling in her heart. It was as if the missing pieces of her life had finally fallen into place. She didn't feel alone anymore. She had found her place, her family, and together, she and Garrett could move forward, honoring the memory of the mother they both shared. This was their new beginning,